Hi, and welcome back to another episode of the Art of Unraveling podcast and my YouTube channel. Thank you so much for being here. So, today we are continuing our discussion on the ancestors because this is such an important topic. And I think, again, it's just something that's not as talked about, maybe not as well understood. And as I may have mentioned in my last video slash podcast, this work was really brought to me through the family constellation route, which was created by Bert Hellinger, who spent time when he was living with these African tribes as a priest, and ended up learning so much from them, specifically in how they honor their ancestors. They weren't struggling with a lot of the issues, the chronic issues that he saw people in the West struggling with. And he brought this back and started studying it and eventually developed family constellation work and became a therapist and then specialized in this modality that he created. And so there's that element of honoring the ancestors that we don't really have in our culture, other than, maybe obviously we go to the funeral, we mourn, we do things like that. We think of our ancestors, but there isn't this understanding that the entanglements that we could have these entanglements that where generational trauma gets passed down because we're unconsciously taking on the burdens in order to belong to the family unit. And again, I may be saying that and you might be going, what in the heck? I don't even understand what she's saying. You don't do that consciously. You don't choose to take on burdens from your family and your ancestors consciously. It's an unconscious choice in order to belong to the family. So, and I know I mentioned in the last video that there's, science now confirms this through epigenetics and through these things getting passed down. So, the trauma that, I talked about in the last video of my grandfather being in the war and the unbeknownst to me amounts of things he had to witness and see and do, and all that stuff that he buried, the death of his grandfather or of his father, the things that he buried, the trauma that he experienced, that gets passed on to me, to through my mom to me. And we all carry it. Addiction runs in my family, narcissism runs in my family, um, people pleasing runs in the family. Like there's all these patterns of and family conflict. My grandpa not speaking to certain members of his family, his own children, my mom not speaking to me. There's these clear patterns that are shown throughout the generational line if you look. And so many of us, so many of the people I work with that are drawn to me, probably you if you're listening to this podcast, are, maybe unbeknownst to you, cycle breakers. So we are the ones that are here to break these cycles in our family, in our ancestral lineages. And when we do, not only do we help ourselves, but we clear and help generations. So we clear those patterns 7 generations back and 7 generations forward. So this work is extremely powerful, extremely profound, and yet very subtle. And but you feel it. You feel it immediately when you start doing this type of ancestral healing work. You feel it on a very deep level, but it starts to unravel in your life in more subtle ways. And I just absolutely love it. I see such a need for it and a purpose for it in our society. And I'm excited to dive into today's podcast, which we're going to go into signs that you may be carrying generational trauma. And you're probably going to resonate with some of these. And as I like to say, if there's a chronic pattern, whether it's a chronic health issue, uh, for me, struggling with chronic fatigue and low energy as much as I had, and still do at times, like seeing how grief, like unfelt grief, these unfelt things that don't get honored in the system get passed down. And so unraveling that, all that grief and trauma that my grandfather, acknowledging that has started to shift some things within me. Uh, so again, I'm just very deeply interested in this. One thing I want to note before I get into the 10 different things, ways you may be carrying, signs you may be carrying generational trauma. Um, People really like this fact that comes from family constellation work, and that is the firstborn child in between your parents. So your mom and your dad. So if you have brothers and sisters that have different parents, like maybe you all have the same mom but different dads, then it applies, you would be like the firstborn or whatever for each of those parents. Let me try to explain this clearly. So the firstborn child takes on the suffering of the father's lineage. The second-born child takes on the suffering of the mother's lineage. The third-born takes on whatever is left over from the two, and the fourth takes over what's ever left. The fifth takes over what's ever left of that. So on down the line. However, that can skip around a little bit if there's a child that was born that is more sensitive, meaning a more sensitive nervous system, or kind of what I would refer to as the chosen one, which I know we don't like that term because then it means I have to take on everything. But when you're born with a more sensitive nervous system, typically we are that chosen one. When we are born more sensitive, that's part of the, you could say, the curse of the sensitive nervous system, but the gift of the sensitive nervous system is that we're here to show Earth and the people living in it different ways of being. When we have a more sensitive nervous system, yes, things are more intense for us. Typically, we feel more, we we can access more, we're taking in, it's like sensory overload sometimes. We're taking in everything that everybody's feeling and what's going on in the environment around us. Sometimes we're picking up, non reality type things. And it's a lot of information coming at us at all times. So there's a lot of hard things about being a highly sensitive person. But the gift is that we're born different. It affects 20% of the population. We're born different in order to be able to show humanity a different way. And in order to, bring more creativity or more softness or different ways of doing things in many different areas of life, that's really what highly sensitive people are here to do. So I'm going off on a little tangent there, but so back to the lines and the suffering. So if you're if you're an only child of your two parents, so in my case, I have two brothers. Excuse me. So there's three of us. It's me. Sorry, it's my older brother, me, and then my younger brother. So each of us have the same mom, but we have different dads. So that means my older brother, he's taking on some of the suffering of our mom and his dad. And then for me, I'm taking on some of the suffering of my mom and my dad. And my younger brother, some of the suffering of the mom and his dad. So if you're adopted or have like a step, like I have a stepdad, that doesn't count. It's your birth parents. And so that's kind of how that works. People get ask me a lot of questions on that, but it's just something to kind of pay attention to, like just to notice, compared to your siblings, if you do have the same parents, what the difference is. Can you notice, oh, my brother definitely took on dad's suffering and I definitely took on mom's or whatever. Okay. So that's that. So let's get into some signs that you may be carrying generational trauma. I know you're going to resonate with some of these. These are quite common. And so I just want to reiterate too that some of what these signs that I'm going to talk about can also be from your own trauma in this life, your own struggles and tribulations that you're dealing with, that you can clearly identify were issues that you developed based on your family of origin, traumas that you experienced, bullying, whatever. So there's that. But then there's also when we start getting into our own family history and we start looking at the patterns of our grandparents, of our parents, of our great grandparents, of the people that we knew, we can start to pick up we can start to see, I should say, some of these patterns and how, yes, I can explain this pattern from my own traumas and tribulations in my life, but I also see how my grandma also suffered with this, or my grandpa had this. Okay, so as we are going through this, I just want you to kind of think about that. Like, what do I recognize any of these patterns in my family history? And then at the end, if you want to stick around till the very end, I will share with you a way to do this work with me. You can do it either one-on-one or in my new group program that's starting next week, this July, called Healing with Your Ancestors, where we will map your family history and we will be going through over the next 4 months a series of different meditations and workshops and healing sessions to begin to unravel these generational trauma patterns and entanglements so that they no longer have an effect in your life. And we do this through family constellation work, shamanic work, uh, inner healing, and more. That's what I'll be doing with people over the next 4 months. So stick around if you want to hear about that. But let's get into these signs. Okay, so signs you may be carrying generational trauma. The first one, and this is so many of my clients and myself, you constantly put everyone else's needs before your own. So this is that responsible one, that caretaker. You feel responsible for other people's happiness, emotions, or well-being. You're what I like to call the emotional regulator, or everybody's emotional support animal, as I talk about in my book, The Art of Unraveling. This is the one that and a lot of this stuff is very unconscious. Like I wasn't even conscious until I started doing this family constellation work. I wasn't even conscious that I was carrying loved ones' trauma for them. They're just like, oh, here, I'll take it. I'll carry that for you. I mean, that's not something we think about. It's not something we're consciously doing. Or I didn't understand to the depth of which I was being the emotional regulator for the people around me as a means to stay safe. So if this is you, you may struggle to say no, to set boundaries, to ask for help. You might prioritize your or you might struggle with prioritizing yourself without guilt. So we're just constantly doing for everybody else and then feeling drained. I had a client recently where it's like, when it comes to things with her husband, she's planning things and putting things together, and whether it's traveling or things around the home. And she was saying she realized she was more worried about disappointing him than she was herself. And then she started to feel resentful because it's like she doesn't get to have her own experience because she's so unconsciously worrying about his experience. Is he okay? Is he going to be anxious? Is he going to get dysregulated? And I think so many of us can relate to that. I can relate to that, where it's like, we don't mean to do that, right? Like, we don't want to feel this way. And yet it's this knee jerk reaction where we almost can't even help ourselves. That is a generational trauma pattern. It's a carrying. I realized doing the most recent ancestral healing practices that I was doing for myself that made me realize I wanted to do this as a group program. I realized that the women in my family, speaking mostly of my grandma on my mom's side and my great grandma, and probably women beyond them, carried the trauma for the men in their lives. What does that mean? My grandfather, my great grandfather, they experienced their own trauma, but because men in those days couldn't, go to a therapist, that was unheard of, or couldn't talk it out with a friend, men in those days learned to just bury that trauma and show up and be the man. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps. My grandfather, for example, had to be the man of the house at the age of 12 when his dad died, to a very controlling mom and his sister. So it's like that trauma that doesn't get worked through, as we know in these days and age, it lives in our body. It lives in our system. It shows up in all the different ways. It comes out sideways. And the women in my family carry that trauma for their men. So my grandma and my great grandma caretook, and kind of played a little song and dance to make sure that their husband was going to be calm and not, upset at somebody in the family, this, that, or the other. So, and I noticed in a really subtle ways how I was doing that in my own relationships or my own partnership, of this subtle way of just like carrying the trauma, like, again, making sure that he's okay. Does he have everything he needs? Is he disappointed? Is he regulated? Does he need to sleep in? And then I'm over here like, whoa, 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 whoa. Hold on. What about me? Do I want to sleep in? I got to make sure the cats are quiet so that he can sleep in. He never told me to do that. That is something I created because he always has to get up early in the morning, Monday through Friday. So it's like when the weekends roll around, I'm just like, oh, I just want to keep the peace. Let me know if that resonates for you. That was a big one that was an aha for me. Number 2, you feel guilty when you rest. This is also very common for women, and maybe not something you would think about that would be a pattern of generational trauma. Again, it can be from this life, it can be from your own traumas, but it can also have a thread of your ancestors carrying that and passing that along to you, or you taking that on unconsciously. So even when you're exhausted, slowing down feels unsafe. Let that sink in. That's the number one sign of nervous system dysregulation, is being unable to slow down. So we're always in hyper do mode. You may believe your worth comes from productivity. that you must earn rest. Taking care of yourself is selfish. That's a big one. And it's a big one that keeps us stuck in masculine energy, toxic masculine energy, and not allowing our feminine rest, our feminine receiving element to come in. Number three, you have a fear of being seen. This is a lot of my healers and a lot of all of the women I work with in my soul aligned business coaching, helping them grow their healing businesses. There is a fear of being seen. And this comes from a multitude of reasons, but it definitely comes from ancestral generational trauma. You know you're meant for more, but visibility feels terrifying. This can show up as procrastination, playing small, fear of judgment, hiding your gifts. It's a huge one. Number four, you struggle with anxiety or hypervigilance. Again, so many of us struggle with anxiety and hypervigilance. Again, so many of us can attribute that directly back to our own traumas growing up in childhood, different things that happened to us that caused us to be anxious. Yes, and 9 times out of 10, with anxiety or depression, there is an ancestral tie, especially if it's, I would say, if it's chronic. If it's chronic and like really kind of feeling out of control at times, there is an ancestral piece there. Think about what your ancestors had to go through. Mine had to go through the famine, crossing a boat from Ireland, leaving everything they knew, everything they loved behind, losing family members, losing friends, starting over. Imagine the anxiety, running out of food, running out of money. And then I had terror, as I shared in my last video, last podcast. Go back and listen to that if you haven't. I was experiencing all this terror around money. And I directly connected it to those ancestors that came over. So hypervigilance is your body's always scanning, the nervous system's always scanning for the next problem. It's on the lookout for danger. Is this safe? Is this dangerous? Is this safe? Is this dangerous? It's constantly scanning. Our nervous system is doing that anyway, but hypervigilance is when we're just stuck kind of in everything could be a problem. So this shows up like it's very hard to relax. It's hard to trust others. It's hard to feel safe. It's hard to stay present. You can't be present when we're on the lookout for danger all the time. And we're not being super present with the people around us in those cases. This hypervigilance also is connected to my grandfather and being in the Korean War and just the hypervigilance he needed and the anxiety he needed to live in order to survive. He survived the Korean War, but the trauma didn't go anywhere. It came with him. And I don't think I shared this in my past video or podcast, but he couldn't sleep. It was just this known thing that my grandfather could not sleep. And he would wake up in the middle, so he'd just be wide awake in the middle of the night. And his room, if you went into his bedroom, he had stacks and stacks and stacks all along his bed. All of his shelves were full and stacks, boxes full of books, and he'd read every single one of them. Mystery novels were his favorite, but history, he was very, very smart and very knowledgeable about history. And that's because he was up in the middle of the night reading for hours and hours. And I don't know if he ever did go back to sleep, but that came from the war. I never really thought about it. You know how it's like you just hear things about your family members or people you know, and you're just like, oh, that's just grandpa. He just doesn't sleep. Well, when all of this stuff came up around the war, I was like, well, obviously, obviously he's not sleeping because his nervous system is turned on, being hypervigilant, being ready for that next attack. They would get, like in Korean War, they would get surprise attacks. Like it was crazy learning more about the Korean War. But anyway, that is a sign of carrying ancestral trauma. Okay, number 5, you repeat relationship patterns. Different people, same dynamics. You may repeatedly experience abandonment, codependency, emotional unavailability, difficulty trusting others. I know I have been there. I'm sure some of you have too. I I know I probably made a podcast on this a long time ago, but like I used to attract emotionally unavailable men constantly. That was who I attracted. Yes, that could be attributed to the trauma that I experienced growing up, my attachment, all of that, but it can also be a generational trauma pattern. Okay, number 6. I know I've got a lot of these out here too in my list to my listeners. You feel responsible for fixing everyone. You naturally become the caretaker, the rescuer, or the peacemaker. Often this develops in families where children learn that keeping the peace was necessary for survival. So again, we don't always attribute that as being a generational trauma pattern, but it most certainly is. Number 7, scarcity follows you even when things are okay. I already talked about this with my ancestors that came over from Ireland during the famine. So you worry about money, security, or the future despite evidence that you're safe. I cannot tell you how many times that happened to me. A lot. So you may overwork, undercharge, hoard resources. So it's like keep saving and saving and saving and saving, and there's never enough. That was something I used to do, and I'd forget because I don't see it. It's not like I have a stack of cash sitting in front of me. So you don't see it. So it's like in my brain, it just didn't exist. And so I was like going into this terror or this panic if things in my, uh, current situation would change financially. I would go into this panic. And it's at one point, I had done so much work of my own work around money and in my own trauma patterns and my family, my immediate family's trauma patterns with money. I was like, this shouldn't really still be affecting me the way that it is. That's when you know it's a generational trauma pattern. When you're over there scratching your head, like I have done all the healing and then some that there is to do on this topic. Why is this still a level 10 panic? That is a sure sign you are dealing with ancestral entanglements. I can't say enough about that. Terror is the first sign, I would say, terror or panic. If you feel either of those things, my advice to you is to go directly to looking at your ancestry, your history, trying to understand those patterns and making those connections, because terror and panic, unless you were in a war yourself or something extremely devastating happened that you haven't dealt with, those aren't normal feelings, and those are often indicators that there's ancestral trauma present. All right, we're almost through this list. Thanks for bearing with me. Stay with me. Okay, number 8, you experience success guilt. So a part of you wants to grow, but another part feels uncomfortable, surpassing family members, or having an easier life than previous generations. I can't tell you how many times I see this as well. That feeling that like I don't want to be more successful than my family because I might be booted out of the family. I might be abandoned if I become more successful. Really feel into that if that feels true for you. Or I've seen it where it's like, people that have immigrated over here, even in like their parents immigrated, and they feel guilty because they're surpassing their parents or their grandparents, and that they had to deal with such abject poverty, for example. And So it's just this fear of growing beyond them and being, again, kicked out of the tribe. There can be real fear in that. So if this resonates for you, you may unconsciously self-sabotage, stay small, delay opportunities, and avoid visibility. So another thing to think about there. Number 9, you carry emotions that feel larger than your personal history. It's kind of what I was just touching on with the terror and the panic. You experience deep grief, fear, shame, or sadness that doesn't seem fully explained by your own life experiences. This is a sure sign of that trauma that has been passed down. And then number 10, you often feel like the cycle breaker. You may be the first person seeking therapy or healing, the first to set boundaries, the first to question family patterns, the first to prioritize emotional well being. Many cycle breakers feel both called to heal and overwhelmed by the responsibility. So, those are the 10 signs. I'm so curious how that lands for you. Um, I'd love to know which ones resonate most for you. And then, as I said before, if you are wanting some support, if you're like, oh my goodness, I answered yes to a few of those, and I would like some support in my journey of healing that. My Healing with Your Ancestors program is coming out. It starts next week, but if you're watching this video or listening to this podcast later, there will be opportunities to join. It may just be a replay version, or I may do a replay version with private one-on-one sessions available. There's different ways to go about it, but reach out to me either way. But if you want to get in on the group program, that is starting next week. And it's a 4-month program. We do a 2-hour workshop live every month. It's recorded if you have to miss. So there's just one workshop per month, and you get many other things included as well. And I would love to see you there. I would love to support you. This is really deep, transformative work that will begin to shift those patterns, especially if you've already done a lot of work on your own, you're aware of the patterns, and yet they're still coming up for you. I would love to do this work with you because you will see how things start to shift once we honor those parts of our story, parts of our ancestor story, parts of our lineage, parts of what our ancestors had to go through so that we could survive. I always find that so fascinating as well, is just what the ancestors had to go through. Like the fact that you and I are alive is because somebody had to go through some sort of trial and tribulation. That's guaranteed. Somebody in our ancestral line had to go through something extremely hard. No ancestor throughout our entire lineage, all of our ancestors it's just impossible to think that they all had these easy breezy lives, because we all know things were treacherous back in the day and survival was really difficult. So it's kind of a miracle that you are sitting here listening to this and that I'm sitting here talking. Like, I know there's a lot of people on planet Earth right now, so a lot of our ancestors survived, but when you really think about it, it's pretty profound, especially when you start, if you know anything about history, or you go back and start looking at some of the things your ancestors had to go through. It's a miracle. It's a miracle. So I thank you for being here. I thank you for listening, and I truly would love to support you on your healing journey, whether it's one-on-one with me, or in my group Healing with Your Ancestor program. This work has really been foundational for me and a huge piece of my personal puzzle in healing. So I would love to support you in that. message me. There'll be a link below the video or the podcast. You can always find me at purelightwellness.com or email me at erin@purelightwellness.com as well. So thank you so much, and I hope you have a wonderful day, and I hope I get to see you again here very soon.